David Wiesner is an American illustrator and author and is one of the best-loved and most highly acclaimed picture book creators in the world. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages and have won numerous awards in the United States and abroad. David generally spends several years creating each new book, sketching many versions and revising them until the storyline flows smoothly and each image works the way he wants it to. He creates 3D models of objects he can't observe in real life, such as flying pigs and lizards standing upright, to add authenticity to his drawings. On World Book Day this year, Just Imagine have arranged a special audience with David, and prior to this he talked more to Nikki Gamble about his award-winning career.
I wanted to start by really thinking about your special contribution to Picture Book. There's been a retrospective of your work in the Santa Barbara Museum in the United States, and it talks about the art of the wordless picture book. But that tag's not quite accurate, really, is it? Because very few of them are genuinely wordless.
Ultimately, the story is the most important thing, and what the story needs is what I will use. And so text is occasionally just the right thing to have. So Tuesday, the times of the day, it's very minimal, but not only is it a nice way to separate the various episodes that happen, but it looks great graphically, those few numbers on that white page. I had no problem using that. Mr. Waffles, most of the text you can't read because it's an alien language, an insect language, which I loved, dialogue you can't read. It's great. But of course the context is the context of the pictures and the body language, the facial expressions tell you what's being said. But it also has a little bit of dialogue from the parent, the adult who's talking to the cat at the beginning and the end, because again that just makes sense. So I use what I need to use. That seems appropriate for the story.
Absolutely, and it's really interesting. I wrote down the words, as you said, the times of the day for Tuesday, and I was trying to imagine, well, what would that story be like if those words weren't there? I asked the same question to Jessica Love. You probably know Julian is a Mermaid, which was originally going to be without any words at all, and then she found that people interpreted her character as a little girl, and it's quite important for the story that it's a little boy. So I thought about this in relation to Tuesday and the minimal text there, and what would the story be like without it? It's quite important, isn't it?
I'm sure I could have done it without found a way to have a visual way to break up those little sections of the book, but the whole span of the day, the graphic of the clock on the front, seeing the clock, I could have put a clock face, I suppose, but to me it just felt more appropriate to see those numbers. There was something about them conceptually and visually that just I felt worked better than trying to, kind of maybe try too hard to find some visual representation.
That's really interesting. And I think, as a personal response, it's interesting listening to your thinking about that. As a personal response, I think I can never say that word, auditorily, it works too, because you just have that kind of punctuated rhythm in your head as you read the text. It's really interesting. So choosing those words is important. You say Mr. Waffles has not got any language in it, and yet that you can read. But we do try hard to read it.
Absolutely. And I'm well aware that kids, particularly boys, want sort of a glossary in the back or a legend that says, here's what the translation is. And I deliberately didn't want to do that because I wanted to leave it open to everybody. That's the beauty of the wordless book, is that everyone brings to it their own view, their own way of reading, their own voice. And again, yes, it is within the pictures, you can tell pretty much what everybody's probably saying. It may be a little different for everybody the way they phrase it, but the gist of it, I think, is going to be very similar. I had a teacher send me some sheets of paper that a couple of boys in her class who really, really, really wanted to know the translation And they said, well, we'll figure it out. And they went in the back, and she said they spent like an hour on this, just really deeply involved. And so she sent me their work of translating all the text, and it's incomprehensible. It's just this huge, massive writing. It's harder to read than what I created, which I think is hysterical. But to these kids, it's probably perfectly clear.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of engagement that I think is really exciting to see. Even if I withhold it, there's some kids who are going to say, well, I'm going to do it myself, which, how fantastic is that?
It's funny because it just, you're always a co-creator of a book when you read it.
Right.
But that makes it much more obvious that that's what you're doing, because you're having to, in your head, imagine what those characters are saying to each other.
Yeah, and it really does become a collaboration with the reader. I set it up in a certain way, but it goes out into the world, and then I have no more say, and everyone interacts with it in their own way. And so there's no right way, no wrong way. But it isn't really complete until it's read and filtered through each person's sensibilities, and they may be bringing completely different sets of different cultures, different languages, different viewpoints, and that's really exciting. It's a different sort of reading experience than just, I'm going to read the text and then we'll look at the pictures a bit and then back to the text. The text is leading you. This is completely handed over to the reader.
It's interesting to see the kind of trajectory of your work. You've obviously illustrated a lot for other writers, and then would it be true to say that Freefall, I know it's not your first picture book as such, but it was your first
this is the first book that
illustrated
I wrote. Yes, exactly.
book. So Freefall followed by Hurricane, which still seem quite traditional in the way they use the layout, the format, the 32-page format of the picture book. And then we get Tuesday next, don't we?
Yeah.
And there's a sudden, almost experimentation of what you can do with 32 pages. Is that right? Was that part of your thinking process?
Yeah, I had been, when I got out of art school, I was illustrating picture books. Well, not at first. It was textbooks, chapter books, book jackets, really anything I could get. Anybody would pay me to do. And then eventually, I did a couple of picture books. But I really was working towards writing my own, and Freefall was the book that, and it was a long gestation period working up to it to complete that. But, it's essentially this one long picture where everything continually metamorphosizes into the other, and it was just such an outpouring of the kinds of things that I was really interested in and were intriguing to me. That, once I did that, I stopped doing anything for anybody else. Hurricane was funny because it was of the most conventional story probably that I've done. And my editor, it happened to me. It's essentially a story from my childhood, and she said, "Oh, that's great," because it just sounded like a story. And so I did that next and dealt with writing the text. But immediately after that, I sort of jumped back into what I'd begun with Freefall and playing around with the form of the picture book, bringing in elements of comic books and obviously again going back to wordless storytelling, and that was just, it was so, and humor in particular was a big element there, and I was kind of just off, and each time out I finish a book, there's, well, what's next? I'm in that phase right now, and I just start playing around with things and see where it takes me. I could easily have done a next Tuesday. I think there's a lot of people who would probably have loved to see that, but there's that part of me that says, well, I already did it once. I understand. There are books I'm glad there are multiple characters who appeared in multiple books personally, but I just haven't been able to go back and sort of follow up, because there's always some other place to go.
Yeah. You mentioned the kind of influence of comic and graphic novel. We can see that in the framing in Tuesday. Is there also an influence of film coming in there? I'm thinking about that opening page, which looks like your kind of traditional establishing shot, moving in those frames, getting ever closer to the subject.
Absolutely. I love film. Starting in high school, I was making 8mm movies And I did some filmmaking while I was in art school, and I love it. I've, many a film class, just have seen hundreds and hundreds of films, and certainly that cinematic quality is something that's important to me. Really thinking of different viewpoints to take, whether an aerial view or a very low, long, in those terms, long shot, medium shot, close up, and organizing a book so that I'm varying all those ways that you see the picture, so it doesn't become static, so it's not the same, from the same vantage point, every picture, breaking it up into lots of little panels and then a great big double page spread and maybe a single page, so that you get a rhythm to the pictures, and it becomes just an interesting visual reading experience. But film is a huge part of that. At some point I can tell you how the Shining influenced Tuesday.
Please do. Tell me now.
You want to know? Okay. I was going to bring this up before, but so I don't know how well you recall the film.
Very much. The first
yes.
one. Yeah, with Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, we don't want the other ones. Yeah. So yes, the day it opened, 1980, I was in the theater. I was a big fan of Stanley Kubrick's films. 2001 had a huge influence. That CinemaScope, the long horizontal, all of my books are horizontal, most of them. And you open up the double page spread, you get that same aspect ratio, that was from that. But, I was right there on the day The Shining opened, and a lot of it stuck with me. And one thing in particular, I loved how every so often the screen would go black and there would be what essentially was the time of the day. There was one just randomly, and it was one of the main things that I was, wow, that was so weird, the way it just would go boom, the music comes to a crescendo, and then there's just this black screen with these white, sometimes just 4 in the afternoon, And
you say that, it's so obvious to me, but I hadn't made that connection.
So, of course, there were no video recorders at the time, so this is in my memory, and I did Tuesday in 91, and as I was looking for those ways to punctuate it, I immediately remembered that. So it's, in fact, the sort of the negative of that. It's white page with the black lettering instead of the black with white. But that is directly out of that. How to break up those episodes. I just went, The Shining, I'll use that.
Fantastic.
So there you go.
It's funny, just while we are sidetracked slightly, while we're talking about influences on Tuesday, I had wondered whether, because I think you were, I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say, child of the 1950s and 60s. So I wondered whether, space was quite a thing in those days, and the whole Twilight Zone kind of thing. I wondered whether that was an influence too.
Oh, yeah, I loved the Twilight Zone. I loved all sorts. I watched anything with a flying saucer in it, all the old, black and white monster movies and things. But in particular, the Flying Saucer Association comes out of movies like Forbidden Planet and all of those great old, I love that classic shape. Now they're flying saucers are in all sorts of shapes, alien ships and things, but I love that classic saucer shape, and that came out of just watching all those great old movies.
We should tell listeners a little bit then about how Tuesday Frog actually came about, because we haven't mentioned that on this podcast, and the whole shape thing.
Right, it led directly to how the whole book originated. I was drawing frogs, and I draw a lot of things in my sketchbooks, but the frogs are just really funny shapes and funny faces, the big bulgy eyes and the patterns on them, and just this kind of blob with a face. And I drew several frogs, and then I drew one sitting on a lily pad, and that's the moment when I looked at that shape, the sort of dome-like shape of the frog sitting on the flat circle of the lily pad, and I instantly went flying saucer. And I would never have had that realization except for the act of drawing it. And it's those connections that happen in, your eye to what you're drawing, to your brain. And there was that moment of, oh, and then what if I take the frog and lily pad and make it fly like a flying saucer? And that was all it took. I sat down in my sketchbook and I drew out all 32 pages. And you could read those little thumbnail drawings, and if you've seen the book, you could read every single page. The times of the day were there. The whole thing just came out. It took me about an hour. It was just boom. And you pray every book comes like that. It doesn't, but it sure is nice when it does.
Can I just ask you, while we're sticking with Tuesday for a moment, then, Pigs Might Fly at the end, when did that kind of hook on to the end of the frog story?
Pigs, I knew as I was going, I was working towards this was something would have to happen again. It happens every Tuesday, so I needed the next one. And I had been drawing. I love pigs in the same way. They have the silliest faces and their shape. So in my sketchbooks, I'd been drawing pigs, and I had drawn some almost like they were hot air balloons, literally with a little gondola on the bottom and stuff. So I just went, oh yes, I'm going to use the pigs, and they're going to float away at the end. And I had completely forgotten that phrase, if pigs could fly. And it wasn't until literally the book came out and someone said that, and I went, oh, I was slightly disappointed because that seemed then like a very obvious connection. And I didn't like the fact that it was so obvious, but I got used to it. But it was mostly just, again, it grew out of something that I had been drawing that, I instantly said, oh, of course I'm going to use those pigs floating around like they're helium balloons, somehow.
Just hooking back a little bit to, we were talking about how Tuesday was something of a departure from using the 32-page format. Suddenly, all these other things that you can do, drawing on these other influences. And I suppose that is taken to its extreme in the 3 Pigs, because there you kind of throw the book out of the window. So what was going on when you created that?
A lot of the books have been this building from things that I experienced as a child. Images and ideas can have such an impact to a kid, and you never know what it's going to be. It's different for everybody. But I would see things that I was just fascinated by, and then when I would see something like that again, it reinforced the first time. And then again, so it became this continuum. So there's a cartoon that I remember watching as a kid, Droopy. It's this dog. It's one of the classic Tex Avery cartoons. There's a chase scene, and there's a character who's running down the street, and then he has to turn to go into a doorway, but he's running so fast he starts to skid. You hear him going, and he goes out of the cartoon, and you see the frames and the sprockets at the edge of the film, and he goes out, and there's this sort of big white background, and then of course runs in place a little bit, and then runs back in, and it flickers, and the cartoon continues running. And I remember, laughing, because it was funny. And then I went, wow, he ran out of the cartoon, out of this reality into this other reality and back of the piece of film. That was pretty profound, It was really intriguing. And then I would come across that, in other cartoons. That was an idea that turned up, and then later when I discovered the surrealists, Magritte would play with that, and M.C. Escher and others, this sort of breaking out of one reality into another, and it became just an idea that I was fascinated with, and I was drawing pictures that were related to that. And when I was in art school, we did a project that was importantly in a book format, turning pages, and it was a 10-step progression of taking a letter of the alphabet, black on white, and have it change over the course of those 10 steps into something else. Very graphic. But I had the letter I chose, a W, which sort of got up and kind of stretched and pulled as it kind of moved as you turned the pages until it went right off the page, and then there was a blank double-page spread, and then you turned, and then it was coming back in as if it had been looping around and was now coming in from the other side. And the rest of it, while interesting, was the key thing, this idea that it felt like this open blank page was like a window into the book. If I could put my head right into the book, I could see that W flying around back there. And that was just one of those things I put away in my sketchbooks to think, and I kept thinking, how can I make a book out of this? How can I use that? Because I had lots of ideas about the pages could fall down and the letters fall off and all of these neat things, but I had no story. And I finally realized I needed to choose a story as many people as possible would already know, because starting with something unknown and then leaving it behind was very confusing. So if you kind of knew, oh, this is this story, you could just kind of follow where it went. So I thought, well, what's it going to be? Hansel and Gretel, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, Three Little Pigs. And it took me exactly that long. When I finished Tuesday, I loved drawing the pigs, and I wanted to use them again, maybe as main characters. And I was like, well, here's my chance. Plus, who would want to get out of that story? The first two pigs get eaten up every time you read it. So, motivation was there. And then it all just kind of fell together that they would come out of that reality of the story of the three little pigs. And behind there was this big empty space that actually turns out not to be empty, but to contain all the other stories, and they could go in and out of those other stories where they would adopt the style of that story. And then they would pick up other characters who maybe were imperiled in their stories and form this whole unit and come back to the story of the three little pigs, now able to fend off the big bad wolf. So it just kind of all came together, really about these characters looking for a place where they could be safe, and form this sort of new family unit at the end and literally rewrite the story for the happy ending at the end. So it when the story clicked, all of that visual stuff I had been building up just finally had a place to go, and I had to leave a lot of stuff out, but that's the most satisfying when because it's all about the story. Ultimately, that is the moral why you're doing it.
I read somewhere else that I think you said after you'd completed the graphic novel Fish Girl that you had to leave a lot out of that story as well.
Right.
What sorts of things couldn't go in there? What did you have to discard?
That's always the hardest part of any book, and every book there's things that just don't make it, because it's the beauty of the picture book. It is 32, 40 pages, sometimes 48, but you have to pick and choose what's essential to the story, even if it's a great image that you've come up with, but it's really not important to moving the story forward. It's probably going to go. And in Art and Max, for example, there's as Max has covered Arthur with all this paint, and he starts peeling away all these layers until he's down to a line which breaks, and suddenly he wanted to be an artist, he wanted to have to learn how to create. Well, now suddenly he had to recreate his own friend. So where do you start? You start with drawing. That's the essence. That's the basic. So I had a whole series of pages of him attempting to draw Arthur, from starting with almost like a square with two dots for eyes and a little mouth, and then building up from that, which I loved. I mean, they were really funny, but I didn't have enough space for all of that. The essential elements of the story were kind of plotted out, and I had a certain amount of space, and I had to choose just what would encapsulate that idea of the funny first attempt, and then the next try in getting to that place. So a lot of those didn't make it, but that's okay. What's the essence of that joke, that humor, and bring that down to the amount of the page and the turn of the page. So you set him up, he's about to draw, and then you turn the page and you see the response, and then the next page kind of wraps up that process a little more quickly than I might have liked. It doesn't hinder the story, but I just knew I had all this great stuff I had to leave. Tuesday has I could have elaborated a lot of the humor in that, the one frog being chased by the dog. We move to the right, the dog comes in from the right, we turn and go back to the left, and then suddenly we're moving, when you turn the page, we're moving back again from left to right. So I'm setting that movement up, and then the turn of the page is all the frogs chasing the dog. That could have been a much more elaborate set of almost slapstick events, but the essence of it was, the dog, the little one by himself, the dog chasing, and then his comeuppance, if you will, when you turn the page. So that's a lot of part of writing the picture book, is making those decisions about, what is really going on here, what's the true essence of it.
And actually, by being economical with that, you intensify the surprise. Whereas if you'd spent longer getting there, you might not have had that immediate impact.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it also leaves the reader to fill in for themselves some of what's missing, I think. And one part of me wants to show every little bit of it, but in fact I don't need to, because the beauty of the picture book, you're suggesting all this world that the reader will, you hope, come back to the story and, be bringing that missing stuff themselves, imagining what else is happening. So, overdoing it can be, putting in too much can also be maybe a hindrance. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Can I ask you a little bit, because I guess pushing the boundaries even further, we come to your app spot, and the affordances that you have with digital media are quite different from the sequential turning of the page.
Right.
Did that excite you, that project?
I did. I was, it's an idea that I had been, again, since art school, playing around with. Now, I didn't invent that, sort of the Powers of 10, the great Ames film they made, that worlds within worlds, going deeper and deeper and deeper into something. But I started playing around with that in art school, and I was trying to make a picture book out of that, and I was pretty far into it at one point in the mid-90s, but it wasn't, from a story standpoint, it was still, frankly, not quite there yet, and I put it aside. In Flotsam, I used a little bit of that with the pictures within pictures within pictures, and I thought, okay, well, I've used that someplace. But it was when I saw the iPad when it was first released and realized, you could do the pinch and zoom to make something bigger, I just went, wow, if you just kept on doing that, you would, to me, it felt like a vertical move, like going deep into the device. And I thought that was really interesting. As I watched apps being developed, particularly narrative ones, I didn't think much of what I was seeing, mostly because they kept adding gaming elements. Let's keep score. Maybe you have to win, or if you want to move to this other place, you have to find the thing that unlocks this, that gives you the key to do that. All that kind of puzzling stuff. And then there were activities. The one example I always think of is, there's a piano in the room, and if you touch the piano, it gets bigger, and there's a keyboard, and you can play a little song and maybe record it and do all this. And then when you're finished, you go, what was I here for? Oh yeah, a story, and all of this stuff seemed to me to kill the story, kill the narrative. And, I didn't think it needed that. So I kept thinking if I ever did one, I would have none of that. No gaming aspects, no puzzles or activities, just pure narrative that you move through it. And it was important that you could go as fast or as slow in any order that you wanted. And it turned out my publisher wanted to do something original, so I immediately said, yeah, I have an idea. And it was great. It used the properties of the device that are inherent to it. It didn't try to graft a book onto it. And because it seems like they're not going away, the digital devices, and we have to figure out a way to tell stories on them. It's very hard to sell them and make money on them if they're not the kind of thing that is a game. So it didn't fit into a niche necessarily, but it did what I hoped it would do. And I particularly think if two people, a parent and a child, just start what's going on here, the conversation and interaction will just flow out of that, because it does, as you go through the various worlds, there's references to all the other ones, and you start to, it's slowly but surely.
You revisit places as well, don't you?
And it builds up, and you suddenly begin to see the entirety of it and what's happening and things. Try that.
Did it have limitations that perhaps you didn't expect, and therefore it curtailed some of what you wanted to do?
Absolutely. In the same way that when I did the graphic novel, I suddenly had 200 pages, I thought, wow, I'll be doing all these great sequences of stuff. And in the end, I was fighting for every page and had to take stuff out. And you think, well, the digital realm, it's endless. And in fact, there is a limited amount of space. Each of the worlds, there's 5 you can go into. The thing you don't want is for there to be too much data to load the load time. Any digital person will say you don't. So I had to be able to load and get to it within a matter of seconds, because otherwise people will forget it. And so I eventually found how to understand the limits of the amount of information I could get in there. I could get technical about it, but there was only so much space. So I like playing the scale, things very large, things very small. Well, the really large things ate up so much space, so they all went, so that I could get more story elements in. So it really became a understanding the form and the limits, and then working within that to get as much as I could into it. But I left lots and lots of stuff. Interestingly, the follow-up here is that in one of the worlds, it's full of robots. It's this neighborhood of where all these robots live. And this was a place where I had giant robots and things, and they couldn't go. And I wanted to go into the houses to see what was happening in there. And I had drawn all these things like a whole family, interacting and stuff. But again, from a space point of view, it was like, well, the developer was saying, you can go into one, because then we're creating a whole interior space. I said, well, if you can only go into one, then we're not going into any. You've got to go into maybe 3. But if it's just one, people are going to go around, well, how can I get in the other houses? So all of that interior stuff got tossed. Well, it didn't get tossed, because it then led me back to creating a book using this discarded material that centers around this family of robots. And that my next picture book, which comes out in September, is using just that. So, an attempt at a book idea that wasn't coming together, I ended up finding a digital solution for, and that in turn led me back to the book. So it all kind of feeds into each other, which is great.
One set of problems, leads to the creation of something interesting, and then on to the next project, as you say. One of the things that I really loved about it actually was how smooth the transitions are.
Thank you.
You really do feel that you're not just waiting for the next thing. You really feel that you're moving through a sequence, so it works beautifully. Tempted to do another one, or do you feel you've dallied with that and you haven't got anything more
be totally open to doing it again? But I was fortunate in that my publisher treated it like a book and paid me, in advance. So I was actually getting paid, not on the scale of the book, but most of these are done where you do the work, and if the costs are recouped, then you'll make money. And not a lot of them recoup the money, and I'm certainly not going to work that way, which is why a lot of creators, authors, and artists aren't doing them, which is really unfortunate. There has to be a way to make them profitable, to get really creative solutions, and there are some that are done. I think people can do this at home. Figure out simpler ways to use the technology. Which I think is fantastic. So I'm very interested. As of now, I don't see it on the horizon, but I would entertain the idea again.
Okay. I think we have to talk about some of the recurring themes and ideas and motifs in your book. One of the things that I wanted to ask was about the limits of exploration. It seems to me that you want to go as deep down into the ocean and as high up into space as you possibly can.
Absolutely, and I have a story that I've plotted out several times. I don't know if anybody would go with it, but it starts at the deepest, like on the Marianas Trench almost, with the little fish that live down there, that are the lights, the angler, and it goes to the first, up and out, and then it goes up into space and just keeps on going. There's something about those extremes that's very appealing to me. The journey of it, they usually come full circle, but this one in particular, it's like, well, what if it just, we never know where it ends. It just keeps on going, which is something very appealing about that.
Yeah. And it's the same in the other direction, with things that get infinitely smaller, because we always think we found the smallest thing.
Right.
Is it a proton? Is it an electron? Is it a quark? What is it that's the smallest thing?
The first place I saw with The Incredible Shrinking Man, the 1950s movie where the guy shrinks down and fights the spider, and finally it ends on this very cosmic thing as he's continuing to shrink. And then I read the story that was based on the science fiction story, which went much farther than that. He shrunk to the molecular level until he was within a solar system, and then like a giant among planets, and then he kept going again, the whole cycle again. The atom, the nucleus was another planet, and where he was big, and then shrunk again, and then just moved on to the next lower level, which was like fantastic to realize that it just kept repeating that cycle on all these scales. So, those are the kinds of things that they're lodged in my head, and I just keep kind of playing with all these things, and you see what jumps out and says, this is a story, this takes the shape of a story that I can use. I know years ago I got a review in one of the review magazines that seemed to say, oh, he's doing this again, like one of these ideas, and I thought, oh, maybe I shouldn't, and then I thought, well, no, that's who I am, and those are the things that are intriguing to me, and why not keep finding new ways to.
And they're explored in different ways.
Right,
it's not
exactly.
the same story that's being told.
I hope not.
No. Another thing that strikes me is the interest in looking, seeing, and those that don't look and don't see. So some people kind of turn away. Often it seems that animals and children look more closely than adults.
Yeah, I think that's true. Most of the stories are set in fairly ordinary circumstances, in a backyard, just in the neighborhood. And it's as if you really look at the right time, there's this amazing stuff, extraordinary things that are going on, but most people just don't see them. And being able to suddenly have entry into that world is that moment which is really exciting.
It links in a way this idea of observation, because I'm guessing, I don't know, but I'm guessing that you probably do draw quite a lot from life, because your figures are very observed. Your animals and your humans are really
Yes,
observed.
I don't stylize them a lot. I came out of observational drawing, life drawing classes, and I love that classic approach to anything that I'm drawing. I particularly because when you set up a reality that feels like you can relate to it, when you introduce the fantastical, it somehow can seem even more fantastical. I think that comes out of some of the surrealists that, Dali and Magritte, whose worlds they created were so beautifully realized. So I make models of all of my characters out of, it's a modeling compound. But again, the head of a lizard with lots of horns coming out of it is a difficult shape to certainly mentally turn, as you're trying to draw it from, say, 3/4 angle from above and behind. How do you know what that really looks like? Where are these things, what can you see from the front? So it's obvious, but you make it, and then there you look at it, and so I can get a quick drawing of that, and then I work on the drawing and refine the drawing and change it if I need to, but looking at the actual thing I find is always the best way to see it. So I'm building, houses and structures and characters and things. They're simple. They're not like James Gurney, the man who does the Dinotopia books, who builds exact replicas of all of that stuff. It's just enough to give me the information that I need, so that I also, can look at something from above or below, or how do I want to compose that picture? I can walk around it literally, see it from all angles.
I know you're quite interested in mechanics and clockwork and how all those things. There are a number of your books where almost like Heath. Do you know Heath Robinson? Is he an artist that you have in the States? I know he's a
No, I do.
But those kind of ways in which things work and all the mechanics of.
I love that whole mechanical things. When I'm drawing and just in a sketchbook of nothing in particular, I'm often drawing just weird little mechanical things. It surprises me that I haven't done a book where that's the central focus of it, because it's such a part of my visual vocabulary. So it crops up occasionally, and the robot book is a bit of that, but it's not quite as mechanical as you would think, even though they're robots. So that book is still out there somewhere, but I love something about the machinery, the turning of the gears, the shapes of them too.
You can see it in Flotsam, and you can see it in Sector 7,
Yeah.
and I just think, there's someone that likes a clockwork.
Oh, yeah, the
and
inside of
cogs
a
and
watch,
things.
like the inside of a pocket watch, is just so beautiful. Someday I'll do the book. There's a big chunk of Freefall that I swapped out. That was a really intense mechanical section but it felt very dark to me
Right.
in what was happening in that book. So I replaced it with another section. Yuri Shulevitz, do you know Yuri's? Yuri, years ago I showed this to him. He was very upset. He loved the machinery in the dark, and he said, "Oh, why did you change it?" So funny. I wasn't expecting him to react like that. So yeah, there's still that out there that.
Oh, look out for that one.
Yeah.
For sure. I would just like to ask you about Fish Girl for a moment, and because we're back to collaboration again.
Yeah.
Was that a collaboration that you invited? Is that how that came about? And what was the role that each of you played in this project?
It's another one of those things where I had years and years and years and years of drawings centered around. The visual image was a house that was just filled with water and fish were living in it. And I kept drawing that and sort of dropping in some characters here and there, sort of King Neptune. But I loved the idea that it would have furniture in it. It would be a house, underwater. Not the house underwater, but the house sitting full of water. And so there was this Neptune character, and I had a mermaid, and there was another girl outside, and maybe they were the same character, maybe they were friends. I had lots of fish, sequences, all this stuff. Not a real hard and fast storyline, but I finally realized as I watched with great interest and excitement the growth of graphic novels for kids that, this could be my chance to do, because it wasn't a picture book, it just kept getting bigger. And I said, this should be a graphic novel. And so when it was time to sit down and do that, the writing is the thing that can take a long time. And if it takes me as long as it does in a picture book, I was thinking, wow. And then, but I'd also been thinking about, wouldn't it be fun to collaborate with someone, to work with someone else? I have a few times that I've done that over the years and enjoyed it. And I thought, it'd be great to work with, someone, a full-time writer. And Donna Jo Napoli is a good friend, and we've talked sort of, we should do something together for a long time. And I thought, wow, her books are steeped in folklore. She's written a book about mermaids. I knew she knew a lot about that, and so I just said, I called her up. I said, Donna Jo, you want to do this with me? And she said, yes, just like that.
Right.
And it was great. We talked and looked at all my drawings and kind of hashed things around, and then she sat down and kind of came up with the initial draft of a narrative, and then we went back and forth, but not too much. I then drew the whole thing out, and it was like 300 pages long, because I had to see it, she had to see it. She didn't really have that visualization. My editor kind of needed to see something, and that act told me that a lot about story. What needed to, it was over too long a time period. We had to condense some things, take some other things out. It really structured. So for me, editing was drawing it and then redrawing it, and we then just kind of went back and forth. So it wasn't at the point of we wrote a text, it was done, and now I made the pictures. The pictures informed the text informed the pictures quite a ways through the project, until it finally, was pretty clearly we had it all settled down, and then I had to just make all those pictures.
I was going to say it must be quite time consuming compared to a picture book. I know Sean Tan says he'd never do another Arrival because it's an so
enormous amount of work. Yeah, I would, but I would work very differently. I attempted to approximate the look of my picture books. Clearly, they're not at the same level, but I wanted them to have a relationship to it. I would work in a much, maybe looser style, something, and probably work with someone to do the color. I painted everything, but I would be very open to doing a collaborative, even more collaborative.
Which is probably how most
of them are done that way.
Would
Yes,
work
they
that
are.
way.
And I like the look of digital color. I know how it's done, but I'm not fluent at it, and I was able to paint faster than I would be to learn how to do that. And I'm glad I did it that way once, but I would definitely try it again, but find a way to work that I felt was as, in its own right, artistically at the level I wanted it to be, but also was just something that would not take quite as long.
If you don't mind sharing them with us. What are the ideas that are ticking around in your head now?
Oh, no, I can't do that.
You can't do that. All right, then. In that case, something you can tell us. You can tell us what the next book's going to be, because that's already done and dusted, isn't it?
Yes, Robo Baby is out in September of 2020, and this, as I said, grew out of Spot, which just was triggering potential story ideas like crazy. But it really focused on this family unit. And the arrival, the delivery, if you will, of a new baby who's literally delivered in a box, and the sort of the tension between the parents trying to cope with new technology and their other child who already knows that technology, but no one is quite listening to her. The uncle comes over. There's the mom and dad are Diode and Lugnut. Cathode, Kathy is their daughter. Uncle Manifold comes over. So and they all have the answer, and she finally has to sort of step in and basically take the baby and do it herself.
Fantastic.
So on a visual level, it allowed me to explore that whole world of robots. But again, the story is a pretty basic human interaction, particularly for kids.
Is it wordless?
No, this has dialogue. You can read this dialogue.
Okay.
Yes, isn't that what a concept? It's definitely a book with words.
David, can I just thank you so much for talking to us in the reading corner this afternoon?
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm thrilled to further make contact with the audience here in the UK, which has been a really exciting development for me.
Thanks for listening to In the Reading Corner with Just Imagine. If you have enjoyed this podcast, you can find many more on the podcast section of our website, justimagine.co.uk, plus via iTunes or SoundCloud or your usual podcast provider. Don't forget to pass the pod and recommend this fantastic free resource to your friends and colleagues.